All right. You remember we talked about informative speeches, we talked about organizing patterns, and they help your audience identify the speech as an informative speech, or in this case, as a persuasive speech. We have different patterns for persuasive speeches. This part of this lecture is really, really boring. I'm just going to own it. This bores me to tears to go through these organizing patterns by this time in the semester. I cannot make this interesting. I would like to make it interesting. I haven't figured out how to make it interesting. Sorry. But I'll go through them as fast as I can, if that helps. All right, first up is weakest to strongest reasons. And let's say, for instance, I'm doing a speech to, I don't know, a Greenpeace group, but they don't know what the next project's going to be. And I'm here to convince them it should be to save polar bears. And this is simply least to most important points, except now they're reasons in an informative speech. And it's always, again, from the audience's point of view. Now, if this is a Greenpeace group, the fact that polar bears are appealing is probably not a very good reason to save polar bears. It's a reason, but it's not the best reason. The involvement of polar bears in at least two cultures is a reason. I mean, after all, we all understand that polar bears are not just necessary to the existence of Inuit culture as food and clothing and shelter, but they're also part of how the Inuits, the natives in Alaska, see themselves in relationship to life on the planet and the planet itself. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Polar bears also are part of the story that Western European civilizations tell about themselves. They're symbolic of the last frontier, the last unexplored place on this planet. A place that, none of us will probably get to in our lifetimes. They're fictional creatures up there, unless you've seen one in a zoo, and then they're still pretty amazing. But they live up there with elks and moose and reindeer and Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus and all the elves at the North Pole. And they represent all of that. All of that. They represent the joy and the mystery and unexplored natural existence. Blah, blah, blah. Polar bears need to be saved because they're critical to the food chain. In their territory, they're at the top of the food chain. They keep the population of everything else, those elk and reindeer and everything that the elk and the reindeer consume, they keep it all in check. They keep all the populations from exploding. And without that, the whole biosphere, the natural biology of the region would be in jeopardy. Okay. And finally, polar bears and habitat. Now I want to flip this a little bit because it's not polar bears that are critical to their habitat, but in this case it's the habitat that's critical to polar bears. As I think we're all aware, polar bears are going extinct because their habitat is melting out from under them. Okay? They have no place to be and they're drowning. Okay? But if they were listed as an endangered species, by law, we would have to protect that habitat. And the only way to do that is by reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So in spite of the fact that Congress refuses to list carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, we can get around that by putting the polar bears on the endangered species list and then preserving the habitat under them. So there are 4 reasons that I think we should go out and try to save some polar bears. Yep, they're cute. They have cultural significance. They are part of the balance of the biosphere in the Arctic North. And if we can do it, we'll also preserve that Arctic tundra. Okay, so that's a sketch of a speech, and just a sketch. We get to strongest reasons. And I'm sorry, the outlining, the indentations in these outlines, I don't know what happened, but it's all knocked off. I mean, obviously, this should be indented here, that should be out there, A, B, C, with 1 and 2, under B. This lineup on PowerPoint has just crashed. But this is criteria application. And what we're talking about here is taking the values of the group, and showing how whatever your project is, matches the group's own values. If you do this well, they really can't object to your project. So we've got our Greenpeace type group here, and real simple. You start out, you say, look, we are this Greenpeace type group, and here's what matters to us. We are concerned about the chain of life and the interconnectedness of all species. We are involved in that human connection to that chain of life and how we relate to particularly animals, but the natural world. And finally, we want to maintain the overall ecology of the planet. So I'm proposing today that we take on a new project and we look at how we can rescue polar bears. We say we're concerned about the chain of life. Well, polar bears, they keep everything in balance, from elk and deer to seals and krill, the whole spectrum of life in the Arctic tundra is maintained by those polar bears. And when we talk about the human connection, not only are the native Inuits up there part of the natural connection with polar bears are considered their brothers, and they respect life on that level, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what I'm talking about here, I just want to be honest. In European culture, they are a part of a whole fantasy we have, maybe 2. One about unexplored territory, since very few of us will ever get to the Arctic North. They're also part of a story we tell ourselves about what is there at the Arctic North, because we don't get there. And that's magical beings. And polar bears are right next door to Santa and Mrs. Claus and the elves. Okay? They're all imaginary beings for most of us. And finally, the importance of polar bears and habitat, the overall ecology. By saving polar bears, we are going to have to limit carbon dioxide to save their habitat. And in doing that, we're going to benefit the entire planet. So if we really are for those three things, our next project needs to be rescue the polar bears. So we have criteria that the group believes in, and application. Now, your idea is going to meet that criteria. By the way, these pictures I think are really, really cute until you look at the baby polar bear biting the guy's Achilles tendon. I'm not sure that's so cute, actually. I'm not sure I'd want a polar bear chomping on my Achilles tendon, but there you go. All right. Comparative advantages. I'm rushing through these. Are there any questions before I just rush on? I'm boring myself. Okay. Comparative advantages. This is where you take two things and you compare them. Obvious enough. What sort of proposition do you think you would probably use comparative advantages for? What type of proposition?
I'll say it.
Kind of like the McDonald's versus Olive Garden.
Or value.
Yes. Propositions of value, where you compare two things. Comparative. All right, it's up there. Comparative. Compare two things. Probably works best for a proposition of value. All right. So here we're talking about whales or polar bears. And just to sketch this one out, probably starts with, we've done a great job, folks. We have maybe saved the whales. At least they're off the endangered species list. They're off the endangered species list. I'm not saying to ignore the whales here, because we do have to keep an eye on that situation. But I think it's time to take what we've learned and the resources we've gained in that fight for the whales and look at saving polar bears at this point. I think we're ready to do that. Shoot. Okay. First of all, the culture around the two. I don't know if you remember when we started the campaign to save the whales, but we had a terrible problem. People were terrified of whales. They thought whales were monsters. It's a story that's been told about whales from Jonah and the whale up through Moby Dick. The story of the whale has always been the story of man conquering the behemoth, the biggest, scariest animal on the planet, as an example of manhood. That's been the story of whales. And people were scared to death of whales. Right? We had a lot to overcome with that one. Polar bears, on the other hand, everybody likes polar bears. Polar bears are soft and cuddly, and they look so cute, and they drink Coca-Cola. I mean, how can you not like polar bears? And then there is the race to extinction. As I said, the great white is off the endangered species list. There's certainly still risks out there. Polar bears aren't even on that list, and they're going to be gone in 10 years. Maybe less. So as far as extinction rates, I think it's time that we focus on those polar bears. And finally, let's compare the habitat of whales to the habitat of polar bears. I don't think it's something any of us guessed, but whales seem to be able to live in a dump. Okay? No matter how awful the ocean has gotten, the whales are coming back. In spite of the plastic patch, the great plastics patch that's floating, or I guess now 3 of them, floating across the Pacific Ocean, whales are surviving and to some extent thriving. We can't say the same about polar bears. They're going extinct precisely because of the devastation to the Arctic North, the melting of the Arctic tundra, the fact that there is less solid places for them to be. And although, yes, polar bears can swim, they can't swim their whole lives. So they're drowning. And we learned a lot from the whales and the whale project, and we succeeded. Using a lot of what we learned, I think we can do the same for polar bears, and at the same time, preserve what's left of the Arctic North and maybe pave the way to start reducing that carbon dioxide so that we can start restoring it. Blah, 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 blah. Again, a rough sketch, but you get the idea, yes? We've been talking up to now about speeches to convince for an audience that disagrees with you. This and the next slide, this slide can be used for either one. The next slide is only to activate people. And what that means, just as a reminder, is that they already agree with you and you're ready to take some action. Okay. So in problem, cause, solution, I think it's pretty obvious. You lay out the problem, you lay out the cause of the solution, or you lay out the cause of the problem. The solution has to resolve the cause. Not the problem itself, but the underlying cause of the problem. So in this case, polar bears are going extinct, and these bad things will happen when they do. How did it come to this? Global climate change, melting ice caps, drowning polar bears. So what can we do about this? We have to preserve the tundra, the North Pole, by reducing carbon dioxide, lining up the indigenous folks up there to talk about what their needs are, and ultimately to legislate that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That solves, or at least addresses, the problem of climate change, not just preserving polar bears. If you give us simply problem with solution and you don't give us the cause here, take the cause out. Like that. You're probably going to unconvince us and unpersuade us. If I say to you, the beginning of any semester at PCC, is, quite frankly, hell. And it's hell because of parking. We're losing people who come to campus for the first time, can't find a parking place, turn around, go home, and dip out. We have people who routinely have to come late to class because they can't find a parking place. Parking is a disaster early in the semester at PCC. I propose building another parking garage. And I'm going to guess that every one of you just went through a list in your head of reasons that's a bad idea. Where are we going to get the money? We don't really need one. It's only the beginning of the semester. Can't we reroute people on buses or something? Bad for the environment. Why are we encouraging car use? The minute I did problem and solution without the cause part in there, you're starting to think of why my idea is a bad one. Okay? So please make sure if you do this that you do it completely, because otherwise we're going to come away with all kinds of ideas why your solution is the wrong solution. Okay? But if your solution addresses the cause, for whatever psychological reason, people will roll with you. But if it's just problem and a solution, chances are pretty good they're going to tell you why it doesn't work. I don't understand the psychology behind that. I just know it's real. Okay. And the last slide. That is Monroe's motivated sequence. Some guy in the 1940s came up with this. His name was something Monroe. I should know his first name. If I really dig through my brain, I'll come up with it. But it's just known as Monroe's motivated sequence. Now, I think I've said before, and let me repeat myself, in these persuasive speeches, I am allowing you to break these rules a little bit if it makes your speech better. I mean, I'm assuming you know why the rules are here, and if your speech isn't working, change them up. Maybe you don't want to tell us, as an example, your topic in your introduction. Maybe you want to save that a little bit, okay, and let us know once you've warmed us up. In this case, you're going to have an introduction with whatever you need in the introduction, but you're going to save your attention getter for the first point of your speech. In this case, maybe my attention getter is simply this picture right here. That's a very famous photo taken off the side of a cruise ship, and I mean, clearly that polar bear is dead at this point. That's the end of that polar bear. Now you're going to lay out the problem. Polar bears are going extinct because their habitat is melting out from under them. It's melting out from under them because of global climate change. Clearly, the answer is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and try to stabilize the Arctic tundra a little bit. And we can do that by legislating that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. You're going to get through this problem and solution part of Monroe's motivated sequence very fast. You're going to spend your time here on the visualization, and I'll get back to that. But why can you do problem and probably solution very fast in this speech? Who's your audience?
People that agree with you?
Yes, people that agree with you. And that means they probably already know the problem. They might even know your solution. Okay? So don't spend your time here. You're not convincing people. Okay? This isn't about convincing anybody. They're convinced already. This is just a reminder that leads you to this visualization. Now, a visualization is a picture of the future, either good or bad. Good if it's the future after you've solved the problem. Bad if it's the future if we don't solve the problem. Okay. Don't try to do both. That's too much of an emotional roller coaster. But you're going to give them this picture, and it needs to be You remember way back when I talked about spatial speeches and I talked about my little village? And I had I had all kinds of sensory details in there. I had sounds and sights and action and things happening, even colors. Okay? You want that kind of picture here. A very detailed picture of what the world is going to look like. Okay, so maybe it goes, let's see. So let's project 10 years out. However old you'll be in 10 years, by that time maybe you have some kids. And by that time, for all intents and purposes, the Arctic has melted. Now sure, we've got rising sea levels, we all understand that. But let's take a look for a moment at what the world looks like without the Arctic. Because we have no polar bears. Most of the elk are gone, the reindeer are gone. Most of the terrestrial life that lives up there is gone. We've destroyed one of the biggest ice flow on the planet. And now you have to tell your kids about how there used to be a Santa Claus. Santa Claus, of course, is one of the most wonderful stories about a magical elf who works all year long and travels to every child on Christmas Eve to leave them a present. It's a beautiful story about how every child deserves love, how every child needs something in their life. It lets your child know, it let you know as a kid, that that kind of love and generosity is possible, at least with magic. Unfortunately, with your kids, you're going to have to tell them the story of who Santa Claus was, not who Santa Claus is. Because Santa Claus is drowned. No more stories about Mrs. Claus with her cookies. No more stories about Rudolph. No more stories about elves working and singing at their work. No more stories of NASA tracking Santa Claus around the world on Christmas Eve. And we've lost a story about generosity and our own potential to be good. But you can tell your kids about how there used to be a Santa Claus and there used to be a North Pole. And there used to be polar bears. Because if we don't save the polar bears, that's all we're going to have. Then you go to the call to action. I have here today copies of a petition. I have been to, I don't know, Barbara Boxer's not a senator anymore, Dianne Feinstein's office. And I've asked her if she is willing to put polar bears on the endangered species list, which would allow us to maintain their habitat, the Arctic North. And she said that she will propose this to the Senate and find supporters for this, but she had one condition. And that condition is that we find 10,000 people to sign a petition asking this. Now, that doesn't sound hard, except what she's asking for are genuine signatures, handwritten signatures on pieces of paper, no electronic survey. Okay? And that's when this task becomes theoretically impossible. We don't have the money to hire paid people, so I'm going to have to ask each of you to take not just one petition, but 10 petitions with you. They each hold 20 signatures. I'm going to ask you to get 5 of them filled out, 100 signatures. Okay? I'm going to ask you to take the other 5 and give it to someone you come across who's willing to do the same thing. Let's see if we can spread this organically. Let's see if we can get this done. Let's see if we can get the legislation we've been talking about for so long to save the polar bears and perhaps save the planet.
I'm
Aw.
ready to sign.
I'm sure you're not alone. That's how it works. Monroe's motivated sequence works. It gets people doing something. I'm guessing there are other people in this classroom who are thinking, sure, send on the petitions. We'll handle it. I don't have any. I have obviously not talked to Feinstein's office about this. I leave this to you guys to handle. And I do that because your generation has been very clear that you want my generation out of the way. I get that. I understand. Okay, boomer. All right, I will step back. But I am handing you this as a possibility. If somebody wants to pick it up and run with it in the next few years, it's there for you.